Let's welcome in our guest, author Michael Lewis. Michael, how are you?
You know, all things considered, great. I mean, I'm surrounded in Berkeley, California by unbreathable air and lots of people with disease, but actually pretty happy. It's all going all right apart from that.
The images coming out of Northern California right now, it's apocalyptic would be the best way to describe it.
It's assuming it just passes, have been an interesting experience. But I've never seen anything actually like it in my life, and I've seen a lot. So 2 days ago, the closest I've ever seen to it, the day we had, was being in Norway in the dead of winter when the sun never rose. It just black the whole day. So it's different, and it's sort of like, what else bad can happen? I find moments like this just generally, though, more interesting than depressing or scary or anything like that. And what I do find really interesting is to see how people respond. And I'm in a house with my kids. 2 of my 3 kids are here doing homeschooling, and they're actually, it's just kind of a delight to watch them still be happy in spite of all this and resilient, and sort of like just figuring out how to have fun. So it's not all that bad.
We've had the kids, my 2 boys basically in the house since March, and the resiliency of kids is remarkable. My oldest started like his phase into school this week, and I was shocked at how much he wanted to go to school. And he came home the first day. He only had 2 days of school this week. It's outdoors. It's like 8 kids. They're all wearing masks. There's health screenings and temperature checks every day. And he came home the first day and was like, "Can I go back to school tomorrow?" And we're like, "No, you can't." But I feel like in a way the kids are feeling the same thing we're feeling as adults.
Yeah, but it's kind of great, because if you were making him go to school, he'd associate school with something he shouldn't want to do, and for the rest of his life, he may think school is like an incredible privilege. I get to go to school. It's incredible. I don't have to stay home with Dad.
What has the sort of quarantine situation been like for you? Like, you're such a social person and you're reporting all the time, and you're kind of so how have you kind of like changed your life to sort of fit what 2020 is?
Well, the truth is not much. That I've gone out and I'm in the middle of a book, and the book is required me to go see people, and I've gotten, so what I at first I was interviewing people through masks, and it doesn't work all that well. So what I've done is force people to meet me outside, and so I'm reporting an entire book outside. That's the big difference. And luckily, most of the story that I'm writing is driving distance. So I've had to drive up and down the state of California, but there've been very few flights, so it's affected me some, but not all that much. And I think I had a lot of takeaways from this experience, but I found that the quarantine, and it's been pretty well abided by here in Berkeley. I mean, people have been pretty well behaved. It's been very damning of the life I led before all this happened, because there's all this stuff that I'm glad I'm not doing. And so I wonder, why was I doing it before? I mean, there was just a lot of unnecessary travel, a lot of like speaking engagements I probably shouldn't have bothered to do. And I found that I've been maybe more productive, like words on the page per day, than in any point in my career. And it isn't. And one of the great side effects is no one can say they don't have time to talk to you, or at least no one can say they're not home. You can kind of go find anybody. I mean, really anybody. It's like, if you want to go interview Barack Obama, you know where he is. He's sitting in the house. And now he may not say he doesn't have time for you, but you can find him.
Or if and we've seen this, if someone says they don't have time, that's how they feel about you. Versus like before, it was, okay, I know I'm too busy, da-da-da. Like, if we can't get somebody, we know they just don't want to do it.
Yeah, so it actually, I can't say that it's been anything but kind of a little bit good for the work so far. It gets other stuff. I miss some stuff, but for just like getting around talking to people, I've been able to do it. So I've had plenty of social interaction.
What are some of your? I'm curious to ask you this, because you have such a great perspective on things, and you have a bunch of topics that you've covered in your writing. What are some of your macro takeaways from this whole experience this last 6 or 7 months?
So the biggest one is how screwed up our society is. And it's the sports analogy is we as a society, American society, we're so far ahead in the sciences that you would use to deal with a pandemic that there's almost no number two on the planet. We have more resources than any other country. We have we were the country that invented the idea of planning at the federal level for a pandemic in the Bush administration. We wrote the first ever plans for a pandemic and thinking about the things you could do if you didn't have medicine, like what you could do, the interventions you could do in the society, which have been used by New Zealand and Vietnam and all these other places, but not us so much, or not as effectively. It's like a team that has the very best players finishing last in the standings. And it's like if you took the Warriors from 3 years ago and you managed to go like 10-72. That's what we've just done. And it's a coaching problem. It's an organizational problem, a leadership problem. That's my biggest takeaway. It's sort of like, how did that happen? That we have the best players and we have the worst record. That we have the best players and we have, 4% of the world's population and a quarter of the deaths. How did that happen? And I think that part of the answer is who's the president, but it really is only part of the answer. But a big part of the answer is just that we've had the luxury of being at each other's throats and being uncollaborative and tribal and all the rest, and we're being exposed. Like team chemistry is not good. So that really interests me. It interests me for all sorts of reasons. But that's one. The second thing is the virus is like tracer dye in the society. It's finding all the weaknesses. It's like it's just going out and finding the places and the weaknesses in government, the weaknesses, one of our great weaknesses is inequality. I mean, I wonder, have you ever been on a team where you looked around and you said, we should be winning every game, and something's wrong? And,
sure.
All right.
Sure.
That's what it feels like to me.
Yeah.
It feels that way to me. And so I think it's a gut check for the society. I also think we are a really peculiar country, right? I don't think there's really anything like us. And we really have the ability to bounce and change and adapt and develop and surprise people. So I think I'm actually quite hopeful that like out of this failure, something good will come. But right now it seems pretty dark.
So you are hopeful, because I think there's a lot of people, especially on the left side of politics, who are envisioning some sort of doomsday scenario should Trump be reelected. And you mentioned the exposure to things that this virus has done, and I think the inequality thing is the biggest thing. It's really exposed who the haves and the have-nots are, and it's affected the have-nots exponentially more than anyone else. And we have an administration in place right now who I don't think has the motivation to change policies that would actually help the have-nots, even for our listeners. And I know we Tommy and I are super engaged on social media with our listeners, and the difference in the experience of this pandemic for some of our listeners is crazy. And I just, to me, I want to be hopeful. But I do get the sense day to day of this like general angst about my coach right now. And
well, why don't you get him fired? You can do that.
We're trying. I'm talking to the GM right now. We're trying to get him fired. No, but I actually read something. So I read something. I think you did a podcast with Chris Hayes, I want to say, where you talked about when you were going through post-op of your hip surgery and you had this just general restlessness and unease, and you're trying to figure it out. And you're like, wait a minute, it's because Trump's president. And I feel, and I this is not a hyperbole, but the last 4 years of my life, I've felt this angst that I've never experienced as certainly not as an adult, where I feel like there's this thing hanging over me day to day, like there's someone driving the ship that I'm on, and he doesn't know how to steer it.
Right. Well, so I'll tell you this. It was very specific what happened to me. I just come out of hip surgery. They'd given me these opioids, which I'd never taken. They whacked me out. I was in a weird state of mind watching Trump walk up the steps of the White House to be greeted by Obama. And I had this thought, a very specific thought. How's he going to kill me? I know he's going to kill me. Something's going to happen. It led to my last book, which is all about the risks the federal government manages that he didn't care about. I mean, he didn't care enough about to even go listen to the briefings. And I was so worked up about it until I came down off the drugs that I got as far as actually having a fairly well-known billionaire agree that he would pay to erect in Times Square a clock that we were going to call the Trump death clock. And it was going to just scroll the number of Americans who died because of things he did when he was president. And then when I kind of woke up, I realized it would be extremely difficult to make that calculation in any kind of intellectually respectable way. We'd just be kind of winging it, and so it would serve no good purpose. But here we are in the situation where you can actually make the calculation that if he just managed it as well as the Canadians, there'd be 100,000 people alive today. So it actually happened. And I know your feeling. I feel your pain. I know, and it is surprising to me. What was surprising to me about all of this? Well, one, it's an accident of democracy, right? He didn't win the majority. It's minority rule. He lost by 3 million votes to Hillary Clinton. He's going to lose by some number of millions of votes to Joe Biden. But he might still get to be president. So that's an accident of how we've structured our democracy so that a minority can actually determine who's president. But there is this thing that I don't think has ever completely been properly explained to me, and that I have my own half-assed explanations for. That the American people are more disturbed than I thought they were. Like the people who voted for him there's an upset there, a degree of which I just totally underestimated. And I think my half-assed explanation has to do with status. That you had, I mean, for example, I think that when a black man was elected president, I think there's like a fifth of the country that just went berserk at the idea of a black man. And that partly what you're seeing is a reaction to the progress that Obama represented. And it's an emotional, visceral thing. The whole Trump engine is fueled by anger, right? The stuff they put in the gas tank. It's anger and rage, and that's what keeps it going. So where's that anger come from? From a sense of like stuff's being taken away from me. I'm not important. I used to be important, or my father was important just because he was a white guy. I'm not as important because I'm a white guy. Or legitimately, my factory got shut down, and the Chinese are making the stuff. But I just didn't realize how disturbed the country was, and we got to deal with that. There's no getting around it. But I would say this is what I tell myself every day, and maybe this is like therapy for you. You can take this and like get through the day.
I'm writing it down right now.
All right, write down. Well, there are two things I keep in mind. One is, we've had a lot of trauma in our history. I mean, this is nothing like the Civil War, and we have bounced back from it, and we have this. It's a kind of idiot's ability to reinvent ourselves. Like we have this ability to wake up someone different than we went to bed as, in a way the French and the Italians and the English don't. Everybody else has to be who they are, who whatever they were. we get to reinvent ourselves, and it's built into our culture. But the other thing is, one of my characters I wrote about years ago, a psychologist, like the smartest man in the world, his name was Amos Tversky, he's now dead, once said, he said, pessimism is stupid, because when you're a pessimist, you experience the bad thing twice. Once when you're worried about it, and the second time when it happens. So actually, the intelligent way to go through life is to force yourself to be optimistic. And I've taken that to heart. I'm naturally kind of, and I bet you are too. You smile a lot on the basketball court. You seem like you're basically a happy guy. So I find that if I just encourage that side of me, better things happen than if I sit around worrying about the fact that Donald Trump's president. It doesn't lead me anywhere good. So I think the combination, I think there is, like, we have lots of resources. We're just they're badly organized. We're lacking in leadership. We need a coach. A whole lot of society does recognize this. A vast majority of the society recognizes it. We can bounce. I think we can totally bounce. So I'm not in despair. I may feel differently on November the 4th, but I'm not in despair right now. And I'm just more curious. Like, it's just very interesting to watch us do what we just did and not have a revolt in the streets because of it. We have revolts in the streets for other reasons, but the fact that, we're probably, hundreds of thousands of people are going to die who didn't have to die. And that just can't be said enough. We're unsafe because of who our president is.
We should note to the listener that we're recording this about 3 days after Trump's quotes to Bob Woodward came out, in which he knew how severe this virus was in February. He knew that it was an airborne virus, despite the messaging at the time that it was surface-based. Clean your surfaces, wash your hands, don't touch your hands to your mouth or your eyes. So there was, I don't know if it was intentional, because he says it was to not create panic and to keep things calm. But there certainly was a conscious effort to mislead. So I just wanted to note that to the listener, that this is being recorded after those quotes have come out.
Well, I always take everything that comes out of Trump's mouth as almost the opposite of whatever it is that's true. So, but I don't pay that much attention to what he says, and I try to pay more attention to kind of what he does. And it's what he did that it's far more damaging. He dismantled. So the Obama administration, the Bush administration, the short history of this is George Bush woke up one day after reading a book about the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic, in which, 30 million people or something around the world died. And turned to someone and said, "What's our pandemic plan?" And they said, "Well, we don't really have one." And he flipped. And his administration developed one, which the Obama administration refined in an important way. They realized that for the federal government to respond to this kind of disease, the response really had to come out of the White House. And what you weren't going to leave it to the CDC. You were going to run it out of the White House. So they created a position in the White House on the National Security Council to run pandemics and to boss people around. So if, for example, the CDC said they had a good test for the coronavirus right when the coronavirus happened, they'd be checked. I want to see the test, kind of thing. Trump fired that person, eliminated the position. They diminished the importance of the threat in more than just that way. And then when the threat appears, he basically abdicated responsibility for dealing with the threat. I mean, the biggest, he just said the federal government will help the states, but you guys got to go buy your own masks and buy your own tests and cause this free for all and this disorganized response. He basically never owned up to the responsibility of having to deal with the thing. So what he knew and of course, everybody knew. I mean, I'm sure he had people telling him in, late January that the thing in China was airborne and presented some risk. That's not the big story. The big story is that he never intended to deal with it in the first place. And that's a problem. I mean, this is a risk that it's a very strange thing not to deal with at the federal level, to say to the states, it's your problem. It's very similar to saying to the states, hey, Russia's about to invade. Could you guys figure it out? Montana, could you give South Dakota a call and figure you guys how to protect that border up there, get your armies in gear. I mean, it's like trying to fight a war with 50 different states sort of organizing their own armies. And it makes no sense. So the basic strategic decision, which was born, why does he make that decision? Because he didn't know, I think in his soul, he knows he's incompetent. Like, I'm actually not going to be good at doing this because I don't know how to manage anything. So I'll say the states should take care of it themselves. Then I'm not responsible. I think it's probably how his mind processed the thing. But however his mind processed the thing, just not doing the job. It's like the coach showing up at the game and saying, you guys, here's the ball, go figure out how to beat them. It's a bizarre response.
Michael, what do you think this is a broad question, but what do you think the fix to this tribalism issue is? And part of where we sort of come from this, we had Cuban on the show a couple weeks ago, right after the NBA protested and shut down for a couple of days. And we were talking, one of the things we've talked about this in the show a bunch in regards to the NBA in particular, but all the sports leagues, is we have one of our political parties, we have elected senators, Josh Hawley, other guys, Ted Cruz, who are spending day after day, rather than dealing with these problems, they're just like trolling athletes. They're trolling liberals. They're basically, their win, they wake up on a Thursday and their win is to get retweets making fun of JJ or making fun of LeBron or doing this and not going and But like, how do we get to a place where that doesn't happen anymore? Are we just stuck in this lane where now all politics is like, can you do the thing that pisses off the other party, their people the most, and then if you do that, you win?
I thought right from the beginning that it would take a national crisis to bounce us into a different direction, and this is it. This is a kind of a premonition of it. I mean, there are bigger things coming down the pike. I mean, I'm living in climate change here. I mean, so it starts inside individual Americans. Like, we're sick of this. And how our culture changes is really complicated. And I think that the kind of what's going on now, the activism that's going on now, I love what athletes are doing. I love what the NBA is doing. I think it's important. I mean, you just keep pushing. And then all of a sudden, something that seems unfixable or unchangeable or unmovable gets fixed and changed and gets changed and moves. So I don't. There's not an easy answer. The easiest answer is you get better leadership. But even with better leadership, even with different leadership, we've still got a big chunk of the population that is like not on board with a lot of what you and I would think is progress, decency, like making the place better.
Policies aside, this is a question that I wanted to ask you. So one of the things that you got to do when you wrote The Fifth Risk was you got to meet and talk with government employees. And you found that a lot of these people were career civil servants. They could make way more money in the private sector serving their own interest, right? Instead, they've decided we're going to go and we're going to serve the public interest. And yet there's a large populace of the country that, for whatever reason, it seems to me, will always have a distrust of government. And one of the things that Trump obviously ran on in 2016 was this notion of draining the swamp. And one of the problems we're now facing across the spectrum, and we've talked about this a ton, but across the spectrum in really all fields, is misinformation, a distrust of expertise, a distrust of any credible source. And so how do we get around that? how do we evolve past that point? Because it seems like, to Tommy's point, it's just tribalism, and you're always going to have this portion that says, well, I'm always going to distrust the federal government. I'm always going to distrust the people that either are elected or nominated to serve my interests.
Yeah, I don't know how to fix the world exactly, but it did seem to me that what was hopeful is that, I mean, one of the problems is at the bottom of it all is ignorance. Like, the only way, I think, having wandered around the federal government and interviewed a lot of people in it with absolutely no particular agenda except to figure out how Donald Trump was going to kill me. That was why I was there. Just very personal question. What's going to happen here? Is a nuclear bomb going to go off in my backyard? Is like a tornado going to take me by surprise? I just want to know what it is. And you start talking to these people who work there and telling their stories. There's no way anybody who sat and listened to the stories would come away thinking anything but, oh my God, that's inspiring. I mean, I know the truth. The truth is that, sure, there's like inefficiency in the federal government. There's inefficiency in private enterprise. Sure, it could be better structured. A lot of the problems of the federal government is the way we manage it. Like we the people allow it to be managed, the incentives we created. But a lot of the people are like extraordinary characters doing extraordinary things. I think the guy I can't get out of my mind is this guy. I went and found people who were furloughed as inessential back, last year when the government was shut down. They just told your job isn't important and we're not going to pay you. It's what the people are basically telling them. And I picked a guy off a list of the furloughed list. And he was picked just by his where he was alphabetically. His name was Arthur A. Allen. And this is a guy who has spent 40 years in the Coast Guard as a oceanographer, figuring out, not under orders, just because he figured out that Americans die every day because they get lost at sea. Americans have this unbelievable ability to get lost at sea. We're like the world leaders in going off on sailboats and not coming back. And it's like 10 Americans get lost every day, 3 die on average. I mean, it's an amazing number. Yeah. So why? Why do they get lost at sea? Well, a big reason is whenever their boat conks out, it starts to drift, and we don't know where it drifts. We can't find them. The Coast Guard can't find them. And this guy, Arthur Allen, had figured this out 25 years ago, and they figured out there needed to be a science of how 1,000 different objects drifted at sea. And he went out to the Long Island Sound and studied the drift characteristics of everything from like a Cuban life raft to an inner tube to a 18-foot sailboat, and wrote the algorithms so that when someone is lost at sea, if you know what they're on, you know how they're drifting. This guy all by himself, being paid, a government salary, has saved thousands of lives. I mean, it's an unbelievably cool story, and it's not a atypical story. The week after his algorithm was released, this was like, I don't know, a decade ago, the Coast Guard started using it. A 300-pound man runs off a cruise ship 80 miles east of Miami, just runs off of it, out of his window, naked. And he's usually fat, so he can float like a cork forever. He's drunk. This Arthur A. Allen has calculated how a fat guy drifts in the water. And they pluck him out of the sea 8 hours later, and he's alive today because of Arthur A. Allen. So this guy, we tell this guy who's devoted his whole life to this crazy thing, figuring out how things drift at sea, saving thousands of American lives, that he's not just useless and not worth paying, but that he's like deep state and like in kind of some conspiracy. So I found that kind of a story over and over and over, where the person is doing something very concrete, very useful, and people just don't know. So part of the how do you fix the problem, my response was, well, you tell America, you show people what people are actually doing in there before you dismiss what they're doing as deep state stuff, or inefficient or wasteful. And if you do that, you give everybody a civics lesson, maybe you get a little change. You get that idea into the bloodstream of the culture, and maybe you get a little change. I don't think it's gonna be easy. But I think there is. You kind of have to. It's like an addict. You kind of have to hit bottom before you realize you've got to change. And I got the feeling we're kind of hitting bottom here. That's what it feels like.
Seems like federal employees, maybe they just need a good PR or marketing team.
Totally.
We need a good like PR strategy to get the stories out. We need to get the stories out.
Well, no, it's totally true. I mean, it's just like, it's totally true that if they just had the right kind of light shine on them, people would take a different view of it. But the bigger issues, it's sort of like, I think a lot of people have a sense that we are. I mean, I bet you're more engaged now as a citizen than you were 10 years ago. I'm more engaged now as a citizen than I was 10 years ago. I think a lot of people are more engaged now as a citizen, and that's going to pay off. So I'm betting on us bouncing, but partly because it's just stupid to be pessimistic.
Right. Well, I think the long-term effects of anything when there's more engagement is going to be positive. Because we can, in a number of years, figure out, all right, what is the America that sort of we all want, that our generation wants. Tommy and I, we've said this before, but the generation directly below me is just so active. They're so smart. Tommy and I, a couple years ago, we met with the March for Our Lives kids in New York City. And a lot of them, of course, were from Parkland, Florida. But a number of the kids in the room were from the Bronx, we're from Chicago, we're from LA. And we sat with them for a couple hours, and I was in awe. I was literally blown away at the passion, the level of intellect in the room, just how much they cared about America. Of course, and these are all kids that had gone through incredibly traumatic stuff, whether it was a school shooting or a friend dying through gun violence. And you've seen that again now during these protests about social justice. And so for me, I am very optimistic because I think my generation, the generation below me, there is more engagement. And some of it for me, and Tommy, you've been like this your whole life as far as I know, but some of it for me, I feel a sense of guilt because it wasn't really for me until like 2014. And when I went through the Donald Sterling situation and lived through that and saw how that impacted and affected the people that I loved, I was like, oh, I've got to be more involved in things now. Yeah.
No, that makes total sense to me. And I mean, maybe cultures work a bit like science. There's a famous book about how science progresses and scientific culture changes called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions by a man named Thomas Kuhn. And there's this famous line in that book where he says, science progresses a funeral at a time. And what he means is that some young physicist figures out that they're quarks, and all the old physicists say there's no such thing as a quark, and because they didn't know about it. And then they die, and everybody agrees, yeah, they're quarks. Or, I mean, I had this experience with my book Moneyball, right? That everybody agrees that like batting average is important, and that's the most important thing a hitter can do. And the Oakland A's come along with a lot of smart people and say, actually, we can win games better if we ignore that statistic and look at on base percentage. And they start to do really well. And it isn't that everybody who thought that batting average was important just changes their minds. They don't. They die, or they get fired. But they get old and they die. And the young people who figured out that the new stuff is the right stuff, they rise up. So that's what I assume is going to happen in our culture, is that, that it's going to renew itself from below. That the future is young people. And I'm with you. My kids, my children are now 21, 18, and 13. And the 13-year-old's a boy and a knuckle dragger, so he has no particular views. But the girls, my daughters, they're involved and care and are doing stuff on both racial issues and climate change that is so far beyond anything I would have thought to do at their age, and their friends are the same way. So I'm taking this as a sign that we're going in some direction that's a good direction. And it's just a little bumpy.
Yeah. Let's talk about Moneyball for a minute, because we wanted to touch on this and you brought it up. When you
are you gonna lay into me?
No.
Are you gonna say you're full of shit?
I'm curious where this is going. We didn't talk about this before.
Let's talk about Moneyball. There's really those pictures.
Oh my gosh! I'm quick story, because you brought this up. So I'm very clear about this. I'm not an anti-analytics person. Okay, I'm very. So I got to tell this story. So at some point, so it was probably like mid-May to early June. I got a high school teammate, an AAU teammate that I grew up with, who's a coach, and he asked me to do this Zoom call with about 90 college coaches. And on the Zoom call was me and two other NBA guys, NBA players. And we're on the call for about an hour and a half. And my wife's kind of tugging at me by like the beginning of hour two. She's tugging at me like, hey, come to bed. It's 10:30 at night, whatever. So I'm like, all right, I'm looking for a point where I can sort of break away from the call. So a coach gets on and he's like, asked about analytics, and he asked about the importance of it and how we can apply it to college basketball. And the first two guys on the call go on this just incredible rant about just the dangers of analytics and how the eye test is really all that matters. And I look at my wife and I'm like, okay, now's the time. Like it's coming. So I was like, they go first, and then I'm like, oh guys, I'm sorry, it's 10:30, I gotta go, because I didn't want to like make these guys, look bad or anything. But I am, to be clear, I think there's so much value in data, and there's so much value in analytics. And to the point I was going to make is just how much that has evolved, specifically in basketball. The first time I heard points per possession was my very first day with Stan Van Gundy. And this was 2007 or 2008. I guess it was 2007 was his first year. And we're in training camp. And he starts talking about the type of shots we want. And I was like, what? And he goes through and he's like, a corner three is worth this many points per possession. A free throw is worth this. A layup is worth this. You see these areas right here? They're not worth shit, the mid-range. So these are the shots we want, and then we're gonna make our offense so that we get these shots. And I was like, whoa, I'd never heard it. This is 2007. I'd never heard that before. My question about Moneyball was basically the impact that it had across sports. So you're writing this in a very micro way about the Oakland Athletics and Billy Beane. As you're writing this book, did you get the sense that this was going to have such an impact on sports as a whole?
The first thing I thought it was going to do was cause people to question how people got value, because I thought that was the interesting story. I thought, what an incredible thing that this sport, it basically hasn't changed in 100 years. Baseball has got data attached to every move that the player makes, right? It's not like they weren't stats for baseball players. And it's got, a million eyes on every game. That this has got dramatically misvalued players because people aren't accessing the really important information about the players. And I thought what people would take away from that is, well, if it can happen in baseball, it can happen anywhere. Like every corporation must have people in it who are misvalued in this, because, if you can't value a baseball player properly, how can you value like some corporate employee properly? So I was thinking that. I wasn't thinking about how it was going to spill over into other sports, but it happened instantly. Within a year of the book coming out, I had calls from owners and GMs from football and basketball, and then weird stuff like Indian cricket and Australian rugby, and like there wasn't a thing that I didn't get a call. And normally what I do is I just send them on to Billy Beane to talk to them about what they were doing. I didn't have anything to add. I said, I wrote what I knew in the book. But the basketball connection became meaningful to me because the then owner of the Houston Rockets read the book. And he said, I want to do that. This makes total sense to me. And he hired Daryl Morey to be the GM, who became the kind of advance man for the whole movement. And Daryl actually was really mostly people. It's funny, the whole nerd movement in sports, there are two kinds of nerds. They're nerds who really wish they were jocks. And so when they collide with jock culture, they try to they start to lift weights and they start to kind of look like they maybe played something in high school. And there's that nerd, and they don't want anything to do. They don't want anybody to know that what they are in their hearts are nerds. And so they don't want to acknowledge like Moneyball had anything to do with what they do. Then they're nerds who just know they're nerds. And Daryl's a nerd who knows he's a nerd, even though he's kind of a big guy. And Daryl called and said, you're the reason I got my job, and I just want to thank you. And I said, you can thank me by letting me into your organization. Let me write about what you're doing. And he let me write like this wonderful story about Shane Battier.
You wrote the story, I think, in 2009.
Yeah,
I read it then.
Magazine,
I read it again like 5 years ago. It's a great story. It's a great story.
It was a wonderful. I don't want to take credit for it because it was just like handed to me on a platter. It was just, this is a wonderful story about a guy whose value is not perceived. And how far ahead of you was he at Duke? Did you overlap it?
He graduated in 2001, and I started in 2003.
Okay, so
but I know. I know Shane. Yeah, I know Shane.
Yeah, how could you not, right?
JJ, I had a question for you about Shane. When Michael's story came out, was this a thing that was acknowledged amongst players?
No. We were still in the hero ball era. The player mindset back then was still hero ball. There was no firm understanding of the value of certain shots or the value of certain defensive coverages. And players were not like, you have to understand too, 2009, most organizations didn't really have an analytics department then.
Right.
I mean, I can remember when I first got to LA, there wasn't really a front office. This was 2013. There wasn't really a front office in place. Sterling had hired some people, but there wasn't an analytics department in 2013 with the Clippers when I started there.
It's funny because in a funny way, I think it's because analytics is basically insulting to everybody who has experience. Because what it's saying is, the movement is about the creation of knowledge. It's about trying to find new knowledge on a basketball court or on a baseball field. And then you exploit the knowledge. But what does that say? If you're creating new knowledge, it means that the people who are playing and coaching and managing now don't know everything there is to know. That there's ignorance. And it's very hard. It's got to be, if you're playing at your level, it's got to be very hard to believe there's nothing you don't know about the game. It's got to be a little insulting. Like, what do you mean I don't know where the value shot is on the court? I've been doing this and I'm the best at doing it in the world. So I think that the resistance is that you got to kind of start from a position of a little bit of humility and say, we could find out stuff we don't know. And we could discover that the efficient thing is to take 63-point shots a game. It's played into your career in interesting ways, I bet, right? Because in a funny way, the shots you were taking at Duke were probably not that different from the shots that Daryl Morey would want you to take.
Right.
Right. And so that for you, it's been a tailwind.
For sure. I mean, the value of shooting and the value of a guy who can not just shooting, but for me, I am a high volume, high efficiency shooter.
Right.
So there's maybe 5 to 10 guys in the world that can sort of do what I do. You know what I mean?
Right.
They can take let's call it 6+ threes a game and shoot over 40%. There's not many guys that can do that.
Yes. I know you're good.
No.
We get to this. No. Every podcast, Michael. At some point, this comes out. This took a little. Took a little longer than usual.
Every one of my books has been on the New York Times bestseller list.
Michael, I know you're good.
Michael's had 12 books turned into blockbuster movies. So we're just gonna. This portion now.
But the point. There's a bigger point here, in that there are people whose games actually were being exposed as being not as valuable as everybody thought. And those people are going to be really resistant to this new knowledge. there are coaches who are coaching in a certain way and who are going to be exposed as maybe not coaching as well as they. So it creates enormous friction. And I can see why there's a kind of controversy because people's interests are threatened. So it's for me, it's been, I mean, this is now, I wrote that book, that book is 17 years old. It's still sort of alive in the culture because the conversation's still being had, because the change is still occurring and the arguments are still happening. I mean, Charles Barkley still thinks Daryl Morey's an idiot. So there's he's really funny about it, but he still thinks Daryl Morey's an idiot. So it's, you know, you look at how long it takes for that kind of change, and I think it is progress, even though in some cases, like, it makes the sport, in baseball, it makes the sport more boring, but never mind that. You know, change is slow. So it's not surprising the change in the culture is slow. When you're changing, you're necessarily threatening some people's interests, and those people are going to resist. And you see it in politics just like you see it in sports.
Knowledge is all. Tommy, I just want to point one thing out. So you said the knowledge is always sort of evolving, right? How we interpret data, because the game's always evolving, and you know, we as players, we have to be able to adapt to that evolution. And I've seen it in my career where the guys who refuse to adapt are no longer in the NBA. And I'm lucky that my base skill set already was to be a good 3-point shooter, so I haven't had to necessarily adapt a ton. But I will give you one example. So, you know, I had like a 6-year stretch where I was one of the 5 best mid-range shooters in the NBA, where I'm shooting, I think it was somewhere around 50% or 51%. And my first year in Philly, my 3-point attempt rate was basically what it was in LA, what it was my last couple of years in Orlando, and my mid-range shots were, you know, the same in terms of volume. Philly came to me, their analytics guy came to me that offseason, and he just showed me some stuff. He said, look, you're a great mid-range shooter, but let's just say you shot all those mid-range shots from 3. And he used the example in the playoffs of like Boston running me off the line. So they ran me off the line, and now I'm shooting a 1-dribble pull-up from 17, 18 feet. Here's the value of that shot. Here's the value of the shot if you shoot a sidestep 3 instead of shooting the pull-up jumper. And I have to be honest with you, I adapted because my 3-point attempt rate my last year in Philly and this year in New Orleans was the highest it's been in my career. And so now when I shot fake, I think shoot a 3. When I come off a DHO or a pin down, I'm not thinking curl to the elbow. I'm thinking get all the way to the 3-point line. But it did mess with me a ton. It messed with me a ton. And even to the point where now I'll be in a game and look, sometimes the shot is the mid-range shot. And I'll be going up in my motion, and in the back of my mind, I'm like, I know our assistant coach in New Orleans was Chris Finch, and he'd just kill us whenever we shot a mid-range shot in film. And I'm like, this is going to be on film tomorrow as a bad shot. I know it, you know, and it's tough. And I think that's why there's some pushback as players, because it's tough to be out there on the court and be worried about, is this a bad shot or is this a good shot? Sometimes it is the shot on that possession that works.
Yeah, that makes total sense. It makes total sense. And one of the things I remember about doing the piece with Shane Battier that was so cool was that he had actually taken the data and applied it on the court. That he was doing what you did, but he had done it to his opponents. So he figured out when he's guarding Kobe where he wants Kobe to take the shot from, you know, and you know where he wants to guide him because he's just slightly less efficient there. I remember I interviewed Kobe Bryant. I went into the locker room. I said, what do you think of all this? He was like, it's all bullshit. He can't guard me. What are you talking about?
There's always going to be some ego involved in the NBA.
I know.
You've witnessed that in the last 12 minutes with me. So.
I was going to ask you guys briefly about Daryl personality-wise. You know, it's not just the analytics, but like what he did with the Rockets this year, going small. That's a boldness thing. That isn't just the numbers thing. That is like, I don't care what the rest of the league thinks. I'm going to put Robert Covington, your former teammate, who's 6'6", 6'6", 6'7". Robert Covington's my center. And so thinking about that, have you, Michael, just from like a leadership standpoint, when you're writing about somebody like this, do you recognize that right away? Do you recognize those sort of character traits right away?
Yes, this is what I recognize. It's very simple. When I walk into their lives and start asking them questions, they aren't afraid. They aren't afraid of their own minds. They aren't afraid of what I'm going to write about them. They're sort of like, I'm me. I'm plowing straight ahead. And some of the interactions with them are not, could you be careful quoting me on this? Could you do this? There's none of that. There was none of that with Billy Beane. There was none of that with Daryl Morey. They are sure of who they are. They know what they think. And it's sort of like, damn the torpedoes. And I recognize it right away in the interaction with them. So that's part of this. It's totally possible to be in possession of all kinds of superior knowledge and not use it, and not have the nerve to use it. In a funny way, that's the story of the pandemic. We were in possession of extraordinary resources, extraordinary scientific knowledge, and we just didn't have the balls to use. And that's it's the difference between good leadership and bad leadership. And it's interesting. It comes in a lot of different packages. They're nerd great leadership packages, and they're jock great leadership packages. At the bottom of it, all the qualities bravery. I think it's just courage, and courage comes in a lot of different forms. But those are the people I'm kind of attracted to writing about. Kind of brave people.
Yeah, Michael, I know you got to go. I can't let you go though without mentioning New Orleans. You grew up there. You went to Newman. My two boys were at Newman this past school year. We had just an incredible experience living in New Orleans. The boys had such a great experience at Newman. New Orleans is just such a special place. I want to know what it was like growing up in New Orleans. My son, he had his first Mardi Gras experience this year, and for a week he kept saying, that was the greatest day of my life.
So, growing up, the thing that was most peculiar in retrospect, it was the water I swam in, and I was a fish when I was growing up. I didn't know, but when I look back on it, the thing that was so peculiar about it was how nobody cared what you did with your life. Like, they didn't care what you did for a living. They didn't care what you accomplished. They cared who your mama was, what neighborhood you grew up in, who your people were, kind of thing. And so there was no incentive to achieve anything, which was really charming. It meant that, it was actually genuinely family values oriented. And my father, this is the anecdote that sort of sums up my New Orleans childhood. That for years my father persuaded me that we had a coat of arms, and that on the coat of arms there was a motto in Latin, which he translated for me as follows. He said, these are the words our family lives by. He says, do as little as possible, and that unwillingly, for it is better to receive a slight reprimand than to perform an arduous task. Which is basically, in sum, you have no obligation to lift a finger, just enjoy life. And there was that ran right through life in New Orleans. And it's really going to remember, because a lot of American life is a rat race. And that in that place, the rats are just drinking and enjoying themselves. So,
yeah, it's just a special place. I've said this before. There's just no place in America that's like it. It's its own unique thing, and I just have so much love for the city.
I'm really glad you're there.
Oh, it's great. It's great. I know you got to go. We appreciate the time. We literally could have talked to you for another 2 hours. We appreciate the time. Thank you so much.
Tommy and JJ, thanks a lot.